This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony. Robert Schumann tended to write music in great bursts of energy and in large blocks of one particular kind of music. Until 1839, he wrote exclusively for the piano. 1840, the year he finally married Clara Wieck after an 8-year courtship, was a year of song, and 1841 was his year of orchestral music. He wrote his first symphony in what he called a fiery hour, and he was so excited by the successful premiere that he immediately started on a second. That second symphony that Schumann started in A Brainstorm in May and finished in September of 1841 was the one in D minor that we now know as his Symphony No. 4. These days it's an audience favorite, but the road to that success was convoluted. The audience at the premiere was mystified by the symphony. Schumann was trying out something new, a cyclical structure that introduced the main themes in the opening movement and then returned them individually and in combination throughout the rest of the work. Berlioz had introduced this idea in his Symphonie Fantastique a decade before, and composers like Liszt, Brahms, and Saint-Saëns would use it in the future. But Schumann's audience was expecting a more conventionally structured symphony. He was not particularly concerned by their negative reaction, but he did withdraw the symphony from publication and performance and put it away for the better part of a decade. It was the success of his Rhenish Symphony, No. 3, in 1851, that caused Schumann to take his D minor symphony out of the drawer and take another look at it. He rewrote a few passages, added trombones, made the transitions between movements a little smoother, and presented it as a second premiere. It turned out to be one of the final triumphs of his life. Some of those revisions have become problematic over the years. Schumann had thickened the orchestration by doubling and sometimes tripling parts. He had recently been appointed music director of the orchestra in Dusseldorf, and this new orchestration was a result of his lack of confidence in his own conducting skills and in the competence of the orchestra. He must have figured that by multiplying the number of players on each part, somebody would play the right notes at the right time. Ironically, in trying to save his reputation, Schumann may have harmed it. His revisions were the basis for more than 100 years of critical judgments that Schumann was an awkward orchestrator, or worse, an incompetent symphonist. On the other hand, Schumann's protege, Johannes Brahms, preferred the original version. He arranged to have it published over the objections of Schumann's widow, Clara. But it is the revised version that has become the most familiar in the concert hall, beginning with a slow introduction, like the introduction in Schumann's first symphony, in which spring emerges from winter. But this one has much darker undertones. The violins try to inject a note of sweetness. And both of these melodies will return later in the work. The mood remains dark, but the energy picks up as the basses become fixed on a two-note pattern. That pattern eventually pushes the music forward until the main theme bursts forth in a new quick tempo. It's a faster and fiercer version of the introductory theme, with a few moments of lightness and a few passionate sighs. The passion takes over and builds to a climax. But then the trombones and strings play a note that comes harmonically out of nowhere, like an explosion. They go back and forth, the strings carry the melody further, but the trombones remain with a hint of menace in the air. The more quietly they speak, the more chilling the effect. The development turns into a forceful march. And then a lyrical and tender melody. The contrast with what came before is refreshing, another note of lightness as the development section begins. But this is where Schumann started to lose his first audience with his inventiveness. They were expecting a recapitulation, a return to the opening themes. But there isn't one. Instead of returning to the first theme in the home key, he keeps moving forward, developing the material even more until it's clear that the new melody was where he was headed all along. The opening phrases finally do return, but in D major, not the home key of D minor, another unexpected twist. And after an abrupt and forceful finish, Schumann immediately clears the air with the opening chord of the second movement Romance. One of Schumann's 1851 alterations was to ask for the four movements to be played without a break, the way Mendelssohn had done in his second Song of Praise symphony. Schumann understood how effective it could be here for the patterns he was creating, the twists, turns, and returns. He sets the scene with a wind chord, a tribute to the second movement of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. Oboe and solo cello sing a melancholy song in a setting that would have suggested a little Renaissance band to his audience. The music of the introduction returns, bringing some shadows. But the middle section transforms it again to D major, with a solo violin adding ornamentation. And the Romance returns to complete the movement. The opening theme of the scherzo seems like another abrupt change, but it's yet another transformation of the introduction. The scherzo's trio is a variant of the middle section of the Romance, this time with all the first violins playing the arabesques. Schumann plays with some rhythmic blurring in the trio, then brings back the scherzo. But as he returns to the trio one more time, the blurring continues, as it hesitates and even starts to disintegrate. The music slows to a crawl as Schumann draws out the notes. Then out of the darkness comes the rising theme of the first movement. Trombones and horns sound solemn warnings, but day breaks as the music draws nearer. And suddenly, the finale breaks out in a lively D major. The theme of the first movement returns in the lower strings to underscore the powerful theme of the finale. It's as though Schumann had finally found the recapitulation he had skipped in the first movement. And just as there were in the opening, there are moments here when Schumann reflects his own mental state, interrupting the generally happy mood with shadows of worry and impending disaster. It was less than 3 years later that he tried to kill himself by jumping into the River Rhine. The movement picks up speed as it heads towards a whirlwind coda. But before the final presto, the orchestra sounds one last dramatic cry, a great fortissimo chord that evokes the scene when the ghost of the Commendatore appears in Mozart's Don Giovanni. Like Schumann's first symphony, this one ends in a blaze of glory, but it's not without some moments of doubt along the way. For over a century, the conventional wisdom about Schumann's symphonies was that their structure was illogical and their orchestration awkward. Each of these judgments was the result of one critic's perspective, but they were passed down from generation to generation of music students, and it's only been in the last couple of decades that critics and writers have been re-evaluating Schumann's orchestral music and realizing that while it may have seemed illogical and awkward in light of what had come before it, it was really just ahead of its time. This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony.